Right, so this is a story I've been debating whether to share for a while now. Honestly, I feel like it's straight out of one of those cheesy horror movies, but the fact that it happened to me makes it 10 times worse. I'm not even sure how to explain this in a way that doesn't make me sound insane, but here goes nothing. Let me start with the basics. My name's Dylan. I'm just your average guy in his mid-20s, living in a decent apartment in Chicago. My life isn't exactly thrilling. Work, Netflix, repeat. You know the drill. But there's one thing that makes me a little different. My friend group. We've been tight since high school, a bunch of misfits who bonded over late-night video game marathons and trying to outdo each other with stupid dares. And this story, it's about one of them, Jake. Jake was the type of guy who could talk his way out of anything. He was funny, reckless, and always looking for the next crazy thing to try. While most of us grew out of our teenage stupidity, Jake never really did. He had this obsession with the internet's dark corners. I mean, we've all heard of the dark web, right? That sketchy underbelly of the internet where people supposedly do all kinds of messed up stuff. Jake loved it. He wasn't into anything illegal, at least as far as I know, but he was fascinated by the mystery of it all. He used to say it was like exploring an uncharted jungle, but for your laptop. Anyway, a couple of months ago, Jake disappeared, just like that. One day he was posting memes on Instagram, and the next, nothing. His phone was off, his apartment was empty, and none of his family or friends had heard from him. At first, we thought it was one of his infamous breaks from reality. He'd done this before, taken off to Mexico on a whim or gone camping in the middle of nowhere without telling anyone. But as days turned into weeks, it started to feel different. Like bad different. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was seriously wrong. I mean, Jake was unreliable, sure, but he always came back. This time, it was like he'd been erased. The cops didn't take it seriously at first. Probably just off having fun, they said. His family filed a missing persons report, but without evidence of foul play, it was like their hands were tied. So I decided to take matters into my own hands. I started digging through his stuff, not in a creepy way, but in a let's figure out what the hell is going on way. I remembered he had this old laptop he never let anyone touch, so I got my hands on it. It took me a while to guess his password. Pro tip, don't use your dog's name, people. But when I finally got in, it was like stepping into another world. The browser history was wiped clean, but Jake wasn't as clever as he thought. He'd left traces, scraps of text files, fragments of chat logs and saved links. The links were what caught my attention. They weren't regular URLs, they were these long, jumbled strings of characters that screamed dark web. My heart started racing. I'd heard enough horror stories about people messing with the dark web to know it wasn't a game, but if Jake was in trouble, this might be the only way to find him. So, like an idiot, I decided to go in. I won't get into the technical details because, honestly, I barely knew what I was doing. I downloaded a Tor browser, connected to a VPN, and followed one of Jake's links. The screen went black for a second, then loaded a website that looked straight out of a nightmare. There were no flashy graphics or ads, just a plain black background with red text that said, "Welcome to the market." At first, I didn't know what I was looking at. There were categories for everything: drugs, counterfeit money, stolen credit cards. And then I saw the worst one: human trafficking. My stomach dropped. I clicked it before I could stop myself, and suddenly I was staring at a list of profiles. Each one had a photo, a name, probably fake, and a brief description. Some even had starting bids. It felt like I was going to throw up. I was about to close the browser and burn my laptop when one of the photos caught my eye. My breath hitched. It was blurry and grainy, but there was no mistaking it. It was Jake. The description read, "Item number 4921, male, 26, strong build, healthy. Last seen Chicago, starting bid $10,000. That was the moment I realized two things. Jake wasn't just missing, he'd been taken. If I didn't do something, he might never come back. That's when everything started spiraling out of control. I sat there staring at the screen, my heart pounding like I'd just run a marathon. I couldn't stop looking at the picture. It wasn't just some guy who looked like Jake. It was him. The same sharp jawline, the scruffy hair he never bothered to comb, even the stupid hoodie with the torn pocket he always wore. This was real. Jake was on some dark web auction site like he was an object, a thing. The thought made me feel sick. I wanted to believe it was some elaborate prank, but deep down I knew it wasn't. I'd been on that page for less than a minute, and already I felt the weight of 1,000 eyes on me. I knew the stories, how people could track you, hack you, or worse. The kind of people who ran sites like this didn't mess around. I quickly closed the browser and shut my laptop, but it didn't feel like enough. I unplugged it, threw a blanket over it, and sat in silence, trying to process what I'd just seen. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Jake's face staring back at me, pixelated and trapped. I couldn't stop thinking about how scared he must have been, or still was. What if I was already too late? What if he'd been sold to some psycho halfway across the world? My mind spiraled into the worst-case scenarios, and by morning, I knew I had to act. I called his sister, Emily. She and Jake weren't super close, but she was practical and level-headed, the opposite of him. When I told her what I'd found, there was this long pause. I thought she was going to call me crazy or hang up, but instead she whispered, "Send me the link." I hesitated. Sending someone else down this rabbit hole felt wrong, but Emily wasn't taking no for an answer. I sent it to her with a warning. Be careful. Don't stay on there too long. Within minutes, she called me back, her voice trembling. It's him. Dylan, what the hell do we do? That was the million-dollar question, wasn't it? What the hell could we do? Call the cops? They'd laugh us out of the precinct. Hi, officer. I found my friend on a human trafficking site on the dark web. Yeah, no. So we did the only thing we could. We started digging. Emily had a friend named Scott who worked in cybersecurity. He wasn't exactly a hacker, but he knew his way around tech. She roped him in without telling him the full story, just that her brother might be in trouble and we needed help. Scott wasn't thrilled about poking around the dark web, but once Emily showed him Jake's picture, he was on board. The three of us set up in Emily's living room, the curtains drawn and every device connected to a VPN. Scott worked his magic, digging deeper into the site while Emily and I searched for anything that could give us a lead. It didn't take long for Scott to find something. Okay, he said, leaning back in his chair. This site's encrypted as hell, but there's a chat feature. Looks like it's how buyers communicate with sellers. My stomach turned. You're saying we can talk to whoever has Jake? More like bait them, Scott replied. But yeah, if we message the seller, we might be able to get some info, or we could screw this up and get ourselves killed. Great. Just the reassurance I needed. Emily, being the boldest of the group, insisted we try it. Scott set up a fake account, complete with a burner email and a fake name, Michael White. It felt like something out of a spy movie. Once we were in, Scott sent a message to the seller under Jake's profile. It was short and vague. Interested in number 4921. Details? Then we waited. The minutes felt like hours. I was pacing the room, Emily was biting her nails, and Scott was staring at the screen like it might explode. Finally, a notification popped up. We all froze. Scott clicked it, and the message loaded. 4921 available. Healthy, no defects. Can deliver within 48 hours. Where to? It felt like my blood turned to ice. Deliver? like Jake was some Amazon package. I wanted to scream, but Scott held up a hand. "Let's not blow this, we need more info." He typed back. "Price?" The response came almost instantly. "Starting at $10,000, negotiable." Scott cursed under his breath. "They're local. No way they'd offer delivery that fast if they weren't nearby." Local. That one word lit a fire under me. If Jake was still in Chicago, or at least close by, we had a shot. I leaned over Scott's shoulder. "Can you track them? Find out where the messages are coming from?" He shook his head. "Not without tipping them off. These guys are pros. If we push too hard, they'll ghost us, or worse." "Then what do we do?" Emily asked, her voice breaking. Scott hesitated. "We keep playing along. Buy ourselves time. It was a terrible plan, but it was the only one we had." Over the next few hours, Scott kept messaging the seller, pretending to negotiate. Meanwhile, Emily and I scoured the site for anything that could help. That's when we noticed something we'd missed earlier. A tab labeled Live View. I clicked it before Scott could stop me, and the screen filled with small, grainy video feeds. There were dozens of them, each showing a different room or location. Some were empty, just dimly lit spaces with concrete walls and barred windows. Others showed people, men, women, even kids, sitting silently, their hands tied, their eyes hollow. And then I saw him. Jake was in one of the feeds, slumped against a wall in what looked like a basement. His hands were tied behind his back, and there was a fresh bruise on his cheek. He wasn't moving, but he was alive. For now. Emily gasped, and Scott's fingers flew over the keyboard, trying to pull the feed's metadata. But before he could get anything, the screen went black, replaced by a message in bold red text. "Access denied. You have been warned." "What the hell did you do?" Emily screamed. Scott looked pale. "They know we're watching." And that's when we heard it. A loud knock at the front door. 3 sharp, deliberate bangs. Someone knew we were there, and they weren't happy. The knock at the door sent a ripple of panic through the room. We all froze, staring at each other like deer caught in headlights. For a moment, the only sound was the faint hum of Scott's laptop fan. 3 more bangs followed, slow, deliberate, and way too loud. "No one's supposed to know we're here," Emily whispered, her voice shaking. Scott scrambled to close the laptop, shutting it like that would somehow erase everything we'd done. I grabbed a kitchen knife off the counter, comically small for the situation, but better than nothing, and motioned for Emily to stay back. My heart felt like it was going to pound out of my chest as I crept toward the peephole. The hallway outside was empty. I turned back, mouthing, "No one's there." Emily's eyes widened and she mouthed back, "Don't open it." But before I could retreat, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out, half expecting to see a text from a random number saying, "We see you." Instead, it was from an unknown sender, but the message was even worse. "Open the door, Dylan." I nearly dropped the phone. "Guys!" My voice cracked as I held it up to show the message. "They know my name." "How?" Emily hissed. "We've been careful, right? VPN, burner emails. Scott, how do they know his name?" Scott didn't answer. His face was pale, his fingers trembling as he typed furiously on his laptop. "They must have pinged your IP before we went full stealth," he muttered. "Or maybe your phone. If your phone's not protected, they could have tracked your connection." I didn't have time to process his tech babble because another knock came, this time lighter, like whoever it was wanted us to know they weren't in a hurry. My phone buzzed again. Another text. "Last chance. Open it or we come in." My brain went into overdrive. Whoever was on the other side wasn't just some random creep. They knew we were here, they knew who we were, and they weren't bluffing. I looked at Emily and Scott, who both shook their heads in silent protest. Then, I made the dumbest decision of my life. I unlocked the door. The moment the latch clicked, I regretted it. I opened the door, just a crack, enough to peek outside, and that's when I saw him. A man in a black hoodie and a baseball cap, his face obscured by shadows. He didn't try to force his way in, which somehow made it even scarier. He just stood there, calm and composed, holding a manila envelope. "Dylan, right?" he said, his voice smooth and unnervingly friendly. "This is for you." Before I could respond, he shoved the envelope through the gap, then turned and walked away like he didn't have a care in the world. I stood there, frozen, watching him disappear down the hall. I wanted to chase him, but my legs wouldn't move. "Dylan, shut the door!" Emily snapped. I did, locking it and bolting the chain for good measure. The three of us huddled around the envelope like it was a ticking time bomb. I half expected it to explode when I opened it, but inside was just a single piece of paper. The message was typed in plain black font, no signature, no logo, nothing. "Stop digging or Jake won't make it to his destination. Your move." I felt the blood drain from my face. "They're threatening to kill him." "Not just him," Scott muttered, pointing at the bottom of the page. There was a small, smudged photo paperclipped to it. My stomach churned as I realized it was a picture of Emily and me sitting in her living room earlier that night, staring at Scott's laptop. "They were watching us," Emily whispered. "In here. How? There's no way." Scott looked like he was going to throw up. "It's the camera. Your laptop camera, Dylan. They must have hacked it when you went on that site." It hit me like a freight train. The paranoia, the sense of being watched. It wasn't in my head. They'd been there the whole time, staring back at us through the screen. "What do we do?" Emily asked, her voice trembling. Scott hesitated. "We back off. We delete everything. We wipe every device we've used, and we pretend this never happened." "No," I snapped. "We can't just stop. They have Jake. If we back off, they'll still kill him. They'll just do it without us knowing." "Do you have a better plan?" Scott shot back. "Because right now we're way out of our league. These people aren't playing around, Dylan. They have resources, they have reach, and they clearly don't care about scaring us. You keep pushing and we all end up like Jake." Emily looked back and forth between us, her face a mask of terror. "So what? We just give up? Let them win?" Scott opened his mouth to argue, but before he could, another notification popped up on his laptop. It was a new message from the dark website, sent to Michael White. "We're done talking. Time to act." And then the power went out. The room plunged into darkness, the faint glow of Scott's laptop screen the only source of light. Emily let out a small scream, and I felt my grip tighten on the knife. Outside, I heard the faint sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving down the hallway. "We need to get out of here," Scott whispered, slamming his laptop shut. But as I turned toward the window, thinking maybe we could climb out, I saw the faint glow of headlights pulling into the parking lot below. 2 black SUVs. 4 men stepped out, all dressed in black, moving with military precision toward the building's entrance. "They're here," I said, my voice barely audible. Emily grabbed my arm. "What do we do, Dylan?" I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that we were running out of time. And the people coming for us weren't going to knock this time. Panic hit me like a wave. I stood there, frozen, staring at the headlights cutting through the darkness outside. The 4 men from the SUVs moved with purpose, their faces obscured by caps and the low light. They weren't here to negotiate, they were here to make sure we stopped asking questions. "Dylan," Emily hissed, her voice barely above a whisper. "What do we do?" "Barricade the door," I muttered, my thoughts racing. "Scott, kill the Wi-Fi. Emily, grab your keys. We're not staying here." Scott yanked the router out of the wall while Emily bolted to the kitchen. I grabbed a chair, wedging it under the doorknob as tightly as I could. It wasn't much, but it might buy us a few extra seconds. Outside, the sound of heavy boots echoed up the stairwell. "They're coming," Scott said, his voice shaking. Emily came back, clutching her car keys and a can of mace. "My car's in the garage. If we can make it to the stairwell..." The hallway outside erupted in a loud bang, followed by a metallic scraping sound. They were trying to force the door. "Window," I said, pointing to the one in the living room. "We can get to the fire escape." Scott didn't wait for confirmation. He yanked the blinds open and threw up the sash, the cold night air rushing in. Emily climbed out first, gripping the rusted metal railing like her life depended on it. Scott followed, and I was just about to go when the door splintered behind me. I turned just in time to see it burst open, the chair crashing to the floor. Two men stormed in, each dressed in black and wearing tactical gear that screamed, "Not amateurs." Their faces were obscured by masks, but their eyes locked on me immediately. "Move!" Emily screamed from outside, her voice barely audible over the chaos. I dove out the window, the fire escape shuddering under my weight. One of the men lunged for me, but I kicked back, catching him in the chest. He stumbled, cursing, and I scrambled after Emily and Scott, my heart hammering in my ears. We clattered down the fire escape, the rusted stairs groaning under our weight. Somewhere below, I heard the faint creak of another window opening. They were trying to cut us off. "Faster!" Scott shouted, his voice tinged with pure panic. We reached the bottom and hit the alley, the damp pavement slick under our feet. Emily's car was parked just a block away, but it felt like miles. Behind us, the men weren't far. I could hear their footsteps pounding on the metal stairs above. Emily fumbled with her keys, unlocking the car as we sprinted toward it. "Get in!" she yelled. I dove into the back seat, Scott sliding in beside me. Emily barely waited for the doors to close before she floored it, the tires screeching against the pavement. The SUV headlights were already behind us, closing in fast. "Lose them!" Scott shouted, gripping the seat like it was a life raft. "I'm trying!" Emily snapped, taking a hard right that threw us against the car doors. The SUVs followed, their engines roaring. It wasn't just one vehicle anymore. Both were in pursuit, and they weren't holding back. Emily weaved through the streets, running red lights and taking turns, so sharp I thought we'd flip. Still they stayed on us, like sharks circling prey. "Where are we going?" I asked, trying to keep the fear out of my voice. Emily didn't answer right away. Her knuckles were white on the steering wheel. "The old rail yard. If we can lose them there, we'll have a chance." The rail yard was on the edge of the city, a sprawling maze of abandoned tracks and overgrown weeds. It wasn't a great plan, but it was all we had. Emily cut through side streets and back alleys, the SUVs gaining with every turn. Scott was on his phone, frantically typing. "I'm trying to get a GPS tracker on them. If we survive this, we'll know where they're based." "Focus on surviving," Emily snapped. We hit the entrance to the rail yard at full speed, the car bouncing over uneven gravel. Emily killed the headlights, plunging us into near-total darkness. The SUVs hesitated for a moment, their beams sweeping the area as they searched for us. "Out," Emily said, her voice low. "We run from here." "Are you insane?" Scott hissed. "They'll find us." "Not if we split up," she said, already opening her door. "They can't follow all of us. We'll meet at the old switch house in 20 minutes. Go!" Before I could argue, she was gone, disappearing into the shadows. I grabbed Scott's arm and pulled him out, dragging him toward a line of rusted train cars. The ground was slick and uneven, and every sound felt deafening in the still night air. The SUVs were close now, their engines rumbling as the men fanned out on foot, flashlights cutting through the darkness. One beam swept past us, barely missing where we crouched behind a pile of scrap metal. My heart felt like it might explode. Scott leaned in, his voice barely a whisper. "If they catch us—" "They won't," I cut him off, gripping the knife in my pocket. "Just keep moving." We crept through the yard, sticking to the shadows. The men's voices were low but sharp, barking orders to each other as they closed in. I could hear the crunch of gravel under their boots, the faint buzz of their radios. We ducked behind a train car, holding our breath as two of them passed within feet of us. I could see the outline of their weapons, the cold gleam of metal in the moonlight. One of them stopped, turning his flashlight toward our hiding spot. I froze. The beams swept over the ground, stopping just short of my foot. I gripped the knife tighter, ready to fight if it came to it. But then a distant sound broke the silence, a metallic clang, like something heavy falling. "Over there!" one of the men shouted, and they took off toward the noise. I didn't wait to see what caused it. Grabbing Scott, I pulled him toward the switch house, a squat building half hidden by weeds. We slipped inside, slamming the door behind us. Emily was already there, breathing hard. "I think I lost them," she said, clutching her mace like it was a lifeline. But as I locked the door, I realized we weren't alone. In the corner of the room, someone was sitting in a chair, their hands bound, their face covered with a burlap sack. My blood ran cold as I stepped closer, reaching out to pull the sack away. And then I saw him. It was Jake. His eyes were wide, filled with a mix of fear and recognition. "Dylan," he croaked, his voice barely audible. "They're not done yet. You have no idea what's coming." And then the lights flickered back on. The flickering lights buzzed to life, illuminating the cramped, decaying switch house. Jake was slumped in the chair, pale and trembling, his wrists bound so tightly the skin beneath the rope was raw. Emily gasped and rushed toward him, but I grabbed her arm, stopping her. "Wait," I said, my voice low. Something wasn't right. "We don't know if—" A sudden noise cut me off, the sound of crunching gravel outside, faint but deliberate, growing louder with each step. Someone was out there. My grip tightened on the knife in my pocket as I gestured for Scott to kill the single overhead bulb. He hesitated, then reached up and twisted it off, plunging the room back into shadow. Jake's ragged breathing filled the silence. "They're here," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "They never let anyone go. Never." "What are you talking about?" I whispered back, crouching next to him. "Who's here? Who did this to you?" Jake didn't answer. His eyes darted toward the door, wide with fear, as the footsteps grew louder. Emily clamped a hand over her mouth to stifle a whimper. Scott flattened himself against the wall, clutching a heavy wrench he must have picked up outside. Then the doorknob turned. It didn't jiggle or rattle. There was no urgency, no attempt to break it down. Whoever was on the other side wasn't rushing. They were confident, deliberate, like they knew there was no way we could escape. The door creaked open and a man stepped inside. He wasn't wearing tactical gear like the others, just a black trench coat and gloves. His face was gaunt, his skin pale, and his eyes were the worst. Cold, empty, like the kind of person who'd already seen and done unspeakable things and had no problem doing them again. He scanned the room, his gaze settling on me first. Then Emily. Then Scott. Finally, his eyes landed on Jake and his thin lips curled into a smile. "Well," he said, his voice smooth and calm. "Looks like I'm just in time." None of us moved. The man stepped further into the room, casually closing the door behind him. His gloved hands rested at his sides, empty. But I didn't trust for a second that he was unarmed. "Dylan," he said, his gaze locking onto mine. "You've caused quite a bit of trouble tonight. Do you have any idea who you're dealing with?" My throat went dry. I glanced at Jake. who was shaking his head frantically, mouthing one word, "Run." But there was nowhere to run, not with this guy standing between us and the only exit. "What do you want?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. The man's smile widened. "Want? That's the wrong question. It's not about what I want. It's about what you've done. You see, you broke the rules. You stuck your nose where it didn't belong, and now—" He took a step closer, his boots echoing on the concrete floor. "Now you need to be taught a lesson." Emily suddenly lunged forward, spraying the mace in his direction. The man flinched, covering his face, but he didn't scream or stumble. Instead, he laughed, a low, chilling sound that made my stomach churn. "Cute," he said, wiping at his eyes, "but ineffective." Before any of us could react, he reached into his coat and pulled out a small, sleek device, a remote of some kind. He pressed a button, and a piercing alarm blared through the building. It wasn't just loud, it was disorienting, like it was designed to scramble your thoughts and make it impossible to focus. I clapped my hands over my ears, trying to block it out, but the sound drilled into my skull. Jake was shouting something, but I couldn't make out the words. Emily was backing away, her eyes wide with terror. Scott stumbled toward the door, but the man blocked his path, grabbing him by the collar and slamming him into the wall with inhuman strength. "Enough games," the man growled. "You're all coming with me. You'll get to see how this ends, for him." He nodded toward Jake. "And for you." Adrenaline surged through me. I had to do something. The knife in my pocket felt heavy, useless against someone like him. But then my hand brushed against the rusted wrench Scott had dropped earlier. I grabbed it, gripping it so tightly my knuckles ached. The man was focused on Scott, who was struggling weakly in his grasp. I took a deep breath and swung the wrench with everything I had. It connected with the side of his head, and he staggered, dropping Scott to the ground. "Go!" I shouted, dragging Scott to his feet. "Get Jake and run!" Emily rushed to Jake, cutting the ropes with a pocket knife she'd pulled from her bag. He slumped forward, too weak to stand on his own. Together they dragged him toward the door, while Scott and I held the man off. He wasn't down for long. Blood trickled from his temple, but his expression was calm, almost amused. "You really think you can win this?" he said, his voice steady despite the blow. "You don't even know who we are." "No," I said, stepping between him and the others. "But I know one thing. You're not getting Jake back." His smile faltered, just for a moment. Then he lunged. I barely had time to react, swinging the wrench again, but this time he caught it mid-swing. His grip was like a vice, twisting the tool out of my hand and tossing it aside. Before he could strike, Scott grabbed a rusted pipe from the floor and swung wildly, forcing the man to step back. "Move!" Scott yelled. "Go, go, go!" We bolted for the door, half carrying Jake as we stumbled into the night. The SUVs were still in the lot, their headlights cutting through the darkness. We ducked between train cars, zigzagging to avoid being spotted. Behind us, the man's voice rang out, sharp and cold. "You can't run forever, Dylan. We'll find you, and when we do, it won't just be Jake." But we didn't stop. We kept running until we were clear of the rail yard, collapsing onto the sidewalk of an empty street. Jake was barely conscious, mumbling incoherently, but he was alive. That was all that mattered. We flagged down a passing car, the driver hesitantly agreeing to take us to the nearest police station. But deep down, I knew it wouldn't be enough. The man had been right. This wasn't over. As we sat in the back of the car, catching our breath, Jake suddenly grabbed my arm, his grip weak but insistent. His eyes were glassy, but there was a terrifying clarity in his voice as he whispered, "Dylan, they're everywhere. It's bigger than you think, and they don't let anyone go." I didn't sleep that night, or the night after, because Jake was right. We hadn't won. We just bought ourselves a little more time.